but he determined not to bring it out at once. That sort of thing must be kept till he said it was time to go away. Then he would bring it out and depart in the blaze of success. He had brought a pretty piece of embroidery with him to occupy himself with, for his work had fallen into sad arrears during August, and he settled himself comfortably down close to the light, so that at the cost of very little eye strain he need not put on his spectacles. "Any news?" he asked, according to the invariable formula. Mrs. Weston caught the Colonel's eye. She was not proposing to bring out her tremendous interrogation just yet. "Poor Mrs. Antrobus. Toothache," she said. "I was in the chemist's this morning, and who should come in but Miss Piggy, and she wanted a drop of laudanum and had to say what it was for, and even then she had to sign a paper. Very unpleasant, I call it, to be obliged to let a chemist know that your mother has a toothache. But there it was. Tell him she had to, or go away without any laudanum. I don't know whether Mr. Doubleday was asking more than he should, just out of inquisitiveness, for I don't see what business it is of his. I know what I should have said. 'Oh, Mr. Doubleday, I wanted to make laudanum tartlets. We are so fond of laudanum tartlets.' Something sharp and sarcastic like that, to show him his place. But I expect it did Mrs. Antrobus good, for there she was on the green in the afternoon, and her face wasn't swollen, for I had a good look at her. Oh, and there was something I wanted to ask you, Mr. Georgie, and I had it on the tip of my tongue a moment ago. We talked about it at dinner, the Colonel and I, while we were eating our bit of partridge, and I thought, Mr. Georgie will be sure to be able to tell us. And if you didn't ring up on the telephone immediately afterwards, that seemed just providential. But what's the use of that, if I can't remember what it was I wanted to ask you?" This seemed a good opening for his startling news, but Georgie rejected it, as it was too early yet. "I wonder what it could have been," he said. "Well, it will come back to me presently. And here's our coffee, and I see Elizabeth hasn't forgotten to bring a drop of something good for you two gentlemen. And I don't say that I won't join you, if Elizabeth will bring another glass. What with a glass of Burgundy at my dinner and a drop of brandy now, I shall be quite tipsy unless I take care. The Guru now, Mr. Georgie. No, that's what I wanted to ask you about. But has there been any news of the Guru?" For a moment, in this juxtaposition of the topics of brandy and Guru, Georgie was afraid that something might have leaked out about the contents of the cupboard in Othello. But it was evidently a chance combination, for Mrs. Weston went straight on without waiting for an answer. "What a day that was," she said, "when he and Miss Olga Bracely were both at Miss Luca's garden party. Ah, now I've got it. Now I know what I wanted to ask. When will Miss Olga Bracely come to live at Old Place? Quite soon now, I suppose." If Georgie had not put down his embroidery with great expedition, he would undoubtedly have pricked his finger. "But how on earth did you know she was coming at all?" he said. "I was just going to tell you that she was coming as a great bit of news. How tarsome! It spoiled all my pleasure." "Oh, not a very gallant speech when you're talking to Mrs. Weston," said the Colonel, who hated George's embroidery. Luckily the pleasure in the punitive part of the expedition remained, and Georgie recovered himself. He had some news too. He could answer Mrs. Weston's question. "But it was to have been such a secret until the whole thing was ready," he said. "I knew all along. I've known since the day of the garden party. No one but me, not even her husband." He was well rewarded for the recovery of his temper. Mrs. Weston put down her glass of something good, untasted. "What?" she said. "Is she going to live here alone in hiding from him? Have they quarrelled so soon?" Georgie had to disappoint her about this, and gave the authentic version. "And she's coming next week, Monday probably," he said. They were all now extremely happy, for Mrs. Weston felt convinced that nobody else had put two and two together with the same brilliant result as herself, and Georgie was in the even superior position of having known the result without having to do any addition at all, and Colonel Boucher enjoyed the first fruits of it all. When they parted, having thoroughly discussed it, the chief preoccupation in the minds of all was the number of Rizomites that each of them would be the first to pass on the news to. Mrs. Weston could tell Elizabeth that night, and Colonel Boucher his bulldogs, but the first blood was really drawn by George, who, seeing a light in Mrs. Quantock's drawing room when he returned, dropped in for a moment, and scored a right and left by telling Robert, who let him in before going upstairs, and Mrs. Quantock when he got there. It was impossible to do any more that night. Lucia was always very busy of a morning in polishing the sword and shield of art, in order to present herself daily to her subjects in shining armour, and keep a little ahead of them all in culture, and thus did not as a rule take part in the Parliament on the Green. Moreover, Georgie usually dropped in before lunch, and her casual interrogation, "Any news?" as they sat down to the piano, elicited from him, as in a neat little jug, the cream of the morning's milkings. To-day she was attired in her teacher's robe for the elementary class, though not always now in full conclave, gathering at her house on Tuesdays and Fridays. There had been signs of late that the interest of her pupils was on the wane, for Colonel Boucher had not appeared for 2 meetings, nor had Mrs. Weston come to the last. But it was part of Lucia's policy to let guruism die a natural death without herself facilitating its happy release, and she meant to be ready for her class at the appointed times as long as anybody turned up. Besides, the teacher's robe was singularly becoming, and she often wore it when there was no question of teaching at all. But to-day, though she would not have been surprised at the complete absence of pupils, she was still in consultation with her cook over the commissariat of the day, when a succession of tinklings from the mermaid's tail announced that a full meeting was assembling. Her maid, in fact, had announced to her without pause, except to go to the door and back, though it still wanted a few minutes to 11, that Colonel Boucher, Mrs. Weston, Mrs. Antrobus and Piggy were all assembled in the smoking parlour. Even as she passed through the hall on her way there, Georgie came hurrying across Shakespeare's garden, his figure distorted through the wavy glass of the windows, and she opened the door to him herself. "Giorgino mio," she said, not too angry with Lucia for saying she was busy last night. "And now I'm just going to take my yoga class. They all came rather early, and I haven't seen any of them yet. Any news?" Georgie heaved a sigh. All Riseholme knew by this time, and he was going to score one more by telling Lucia. "My dear, haven't you heard yet?" he asked. "I was going to tell you last night." "The tenant of Old Place?" asked Lucia unerringly. "Yes. Guess," said Georgie tantalizingly. This was his last revelation, and he wanted to spin it out. Lucia decided on a great stroke, involving risks, but magnificent if it came off. In a flash she guessed why all the yoga class had come so super punctually. Each of them, she felt convinced, wanted to have the joy of telling her, after everybody else knew, who the new tenant was. On the top of this bitterness was the added acrimony of Georgie, whose clear duty it was to have informed her the moment he knew, wanting to make the same revelation to her, last of all Riseholme. She had already had her suspicions, for she had not forgotten the fact that Olga Bracely and Georgie had played croquet all afternoon when they should have been at her garden party, and she determined to risk all for the sake of spoiling Georgie's pleasure in telling her. She gave her silvery laugh that started, so she had ascertained, on A flat above the treble clef. "Georgie, did all my questions as to who it was really take you in?" she asked. "Just as if I hadn't known all along. Why, Miss Olga Bracely, of course." Georgie's fallen face showed her how completely she had spoiled his pleasure. "Who told you?" he asked. She rattled her tassels. "Little bird," she said, "I must run away to my class, or they will scold me." Once again, before they settled down to high philosophies, Lucia had the pleasure of disappointing the ambitions of her class to surprise, inform, and astonish her. "Good morning to you all," she said, "and before we settle down, I'll give you a little bit of news now that at last I'm allowed to. Dear Miss Olga Bracely, whom I think you all met here, is coming to live at Old Place. Will she not be a great addition to our musical parties? Now, please." But this splendid bravado was but a scintillation, on a hard and highly polished